The world is falling apart, economies have stopped growing, birth rates are plummeting, and your grandma's cooking just isn't hitting the same anymore, is it? We've all been there. At some point in time, society decides the world is about to collapse. Y2K in the year 2000, the Mayan calendar in 2012, the pandemic of 2020, or that time when I lost my special bottle cap when I was 5 years old and cried for 24 hours straight and thought that this was the literal end of the world. However, each one of those times the world did not end, except for when I lost my bottle cap because life went pretty downhill after that. But in fact, the world has never ended because we are all still here. What we are talking about when we say the end of the world is more about a decline of civilization. Whether it's the standard of living falling off a cliff, eternal warfare, nuclear fallout, or having your smartphone be a lot slower than it was when you first bought it, stuff that would make us reconsider our thoughts about humankind's place on this planet. That is what we are here to talk about. Why society collapses and why we might actually be going through a collapse of our own at this very second. Essentially, the peak of our civilization could have been in around the 2010s, and it might only be downhill from here for at least a few decades. So where do we start off with this? Well, we can start off with the original end of the world. When the earliest civilizations weren't busy inventing farming, writing, or indoor plumbing, thank you, Mesopotamia, they were sitting around campfires wondering, what if the gods just ended it all? In ancient Sumeria, they thought that the world would be wiped out from a great flood from the god Enlil. Over in Egypt, they thought the world would end from the sun going out, thereby turning Egypt into the eternal land of darkness, also known today as Scotland. In India, they said we entered the age of Kali Yuga, which is the age of darkness and decay. And this darkness would last for 400,000 years, but again, they may have been just talking about Scotland. Scandinavia had Ragnarok, where Thor fights a giant snake, and somehow that's the end of everything. Except for Nokia phones, those things will survive just about anything. The Aztecs believed the world has already ended 4 times, but the 5th one is going to be the true end of the world. Just trust them. China believed in the chaos god Gong Gong, who threw a tantrum and pretty much caused every natural disaster to happen all at once in order to end the world. You see, every ancient culture had a myth that led them to believe that the world was going to end soon. They didn't need any fancy graphs or data like we do in modern times. They had that, that gut feeling that the end was near. And well, they were all wrong. Or were they? By our definition of the world ending, meaning a decline of civilization, the world has actually ended many times. The Sumerians, 100 years after their end of the world myth was written down, actually saw their world end. The Akkadian Empire collapsed, however, it was not from a flood, it was actually the exact opposite, which was a mega drought. I mean, imagine if in 2020 the world didn't end from a pandemic that killed everyone, but from the curse of great health, prosperity, and longevity that caused us to have fewer babies and eventually caused a population collapse. Wait, that's a little bit interesting. Maybe we'll talk about that later. Anyways, the Sumerians' ending came to be. The Egyptians, along with many of the neighboring civilizations like the Minoans, saw the end of the world as society began to decline during the Bronze Age collapse. The reasoning for the Bronze Age collapse has ranged from a supervolcanic eruption that blacked out the sky, to more megadroughts, to sea peoples, to aliens. But pretty much this put the Mediterranean world in an era of darkness, like what the Egyptians had predicted in their end of the world myth, and therefore turning Egypt temporarily into Scotland, and thereby fulfilling the prophecy. And during humankind's history, it's almost like clockwork that every couple hundred years, or sometimes 50 years, civilization goes through a dark period where civilization collapses. In fact, one could argue that the greatest history textbook in the world, the Bible, tried to pin down why civilizations would fall. According to the Bible, civilization collapse usually happens through 4 things that you may have heard of: death, pestilence, famine, and the wrath of the Turks. Rest in peace, Constantinople, the rightful Greek claim. Anyways, the last one is actually war, which with my Greek blood is synonymous with Turkish expansion. But each one of these horsemen has helped cause civilizational collapse constantly. Death, or just having low birth rates or low population, was a large contributor to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. In fact, let's talk about that. Now, the fall of Rome was not the end of the world, but it was likely a setback for humankind by several hundred years. In fact, the day that Rome fell was also the day that many think the Dark Ages of Europe started. You see, way back in the day at the height of Rome, a sort of middle class was developing within the empire. The economy was doing well, people were living longer, and literacy rates were up to 20% of the Roman population. Which may not seem like a lot, but at least it's better than modern-day Alabama. Anyways, outside of the imperialist conquests and the needless bloodshed, the Roman Empire was the peak of human civilization at the time, and it seemed like humanity was on a path to something that wouldn't exist for another 1,000 years. But, as we know, Rome ended up tripping over some barbarian feet and eventually fell. Cultural and scientific progress stagnated, the economy collapsed, and literacy rates dropped to about 1%, similar to that of the members of the Parliament for the great nation of Canada. In a sense, civilization, at least in Europe and the surrounding areas, collapsed. It was the end of the world until the rise of the Greeks and the Byzantines, which lasted for 1,000 years more, but who's counting? But outside of death, we still have other horsemen like Pestilence that lead to the decline of civilization. And coincidentally, there was a very small thing that did cause the end of the world. In fact, it was so small that no one knew what it was, or just how it affected humans up until about 100 years ago. You see, one day, a single person started feeling a little unwell. A headache, joint pain, and some nausea and vomiting. No big deal, right? That sounds like every 20-year-old after a night out in downtown Waterloo. But unfortunately in the 1300s, this was a sign that you were about to die. This disease was called pestis, or what we know it by today, which is the Black Plague. Up to 200 million people died globally. Half the European population died within a decade, 30% of China's population was wiped out, but strangely enough, that wasn't China's highest death toll of all time. You see, China does have this thing where it unites and then falls apart, and then wars with its neighbors, and that cycle has repeated for 5,000 years. And in some of those events, like the Taiping Rebellion, tens of millions of people died, similar to the Black Plague. But the Black Plague was devastating, turning cities like Rome into Kelowna, British Columbia. It was truly the end of the world for a lot of people. And don't forget the next horseman, which is famine. Because, well, famine comes in all shapes and sizes. Small famines caused by volcanoes, large famines caused by the Chinese government, and even larger famines also caused by the Chinese government. Now, famines aren't necessarily a problem in most of the modern world today. And then there's the last horseman for the end of the world, and that is the aggression and expansion of the Turkish, aka war. Now, I was joking about this before, but Turkey and Greece have a long history, arguably the longest history of any two neighboring cultures that have a love-hate war relationship. Herodotus is known as the father of history, also coincidentally, according to my grandma. Herodotus is my great-great-great times 2,000 grandfather. Herodotus wrote extensively about the Persian invasions in the histories from the 5th century BC and portrayed the Persian invasions as a clash between despotic Eastern autocracy, also known as Persia, and free, courageous, and handsome Greek democratic people of Athens. This framing made the Persian Empire appear as the great adversary that, if victorious, could end the Greek way of life, essentially an apocalypse for the Greek liberty and culture. And this feeling of war causing the end of the world has come around a million times. When the Mongols began invading neighboring countries known as, every country, Ibn al-Athir, who was a scholar born in the 1100s in the modern-day Turkish region, he wrote down a quote of what it was like being invaded by the Mongols. A rough translation is, if everyone were to say that the world from the time of Adam up until now has suffered nothing like this, he would be speaking the truth. The Mongols destroyed people's lives and ended entire dynasties and empires along the way, but not the Byzantine Empire. Coincidentally, if you look at a map of the Mongol invasions, they pretty much got to all of the Byzantine neighbors and stopped before they actually reached the Byzantines. But regardless, war, well, war never changes. I mean, right now, some people have a lot of fear that the Russia and Ukraine war may escalate into a nuclear war that will wipe out the entire world, once again turning the entire planet into Scotland. But this is actually not necessarily a new fear. I mean, the fear of nuclear war has been around ever since Hiroshima and Nagasaki got turned into radioactive hot pockets. In fact, in October of 1957, Americans could look up into the sky and see something absolutely terrifying. A light flying across the sky extremely fast. What was this light? Well, it was the Soviet satellite called Sputnik. You see, America had yet to successfully launch a satellite at the time, and would fail on their next few attempts. Yet the Soviets launched Sputnik with an ICBM, a rocket capable of hitting another side of the planet with a nuclear weapon. And that satellite up in the sky, well, every 96 minutes, for months, it would circle the Earth, cross the American skies, and there was nothing that the United States could do to stop it. This was called the Sputnik crisis. Newspapers and TV programs are showing how much more advanced the Soviets were than the Americans. They were also saying how the Soviets could potentially use the technology to launch nukes from space at any moment. And even though this isn't typically seen as the start of the Cold War, I mean, the start usually dates to either 1947 after the Truman Doctrine or 1946 during the Greek Civil War, which was a proxy war for the Soviets and Americans. But the Sputnik crisis, you could argue that the true fear of sparking a global nuclear war from the Cold War started right then and there. And yet, the world didn't end. And humanity moved forward to give us VHS tapes, the Game Boy, and 7,000 sequels to The Fast and the Furious. And I'm not trying to downplay the threat of nuclear war. That is something that is still on the table and always will be as long as nukes exist. But there are some things that are certainly coming that might pose a bigger threat to human civilization and actually cause the end of the world. Some of which you may not have even heard of. Here's one. Have you ever heard of Mirror Life? No, it's not a new MMO that's free yet has $10,000 of in-game purchases. Mirror Life is a new branch of life that is being created in a lab right now. Without getting into the complicated science jargon, you can think of it like this. Our body is made up of molecules, so is all life. However, Mirror Life is made up of the same molecules but essentially flipped, hence the name Mirror Life. But here's the problem. Our life and mirror life don't interact very well. For example, a lot of your sugary treats that you say you don't eat but actually eat quite often are composed of molecules called glucose. Our body uses that glucose and turns it into energy so you can, live and scroll TikTok for 4 hours a day. However, the mirror version of glucose isn't really digestible to humans and essentially is a laxative, meaning that a small piece of candy will have you running to the bathroom pretty quickly and won't really give you any energy. But here's the scary part. Imagine this. What if a cyanobacteria were to have a mirror life form? It's actually been hypothesized that if something like this were to be created in a lab and were to leak from that lab, which nothing's ever leaked from a lab, well, if it were to leak from a lab, the entire Earth's ecosystem could be at risk. The mirror cyanobacteria could take over the Earth's ecosystem because it would lack any enemies that could kill it or outcompete it. Yet it can kill and interact with normal life. Essentially, the only way that we could kill this mirror bacteria is just by doing something like burning it, because there's a good chance our antibiotics wouldn't work on it. But theoretically, over time, this kind of bacteria would kill tons of life on the planet and potentially create its own mirror life ecosystem that would make everything not consumable to humans or all life on the planet. So imagine that. Something you have never heard of, which is going to be created at some point in the near future for sure, might actually be a threat to humanity and a greater threat than most other things that you hear about in the news. Now that I've told you about this, is this more frightening than nuclear war? Having an invisible form of mirror life devour everything from corn to the lawn that you should have mowed yesterday. I don't know, that's up for you to decide. But now, this is an economics channel, so enough with the science nonsense, get out of here. On this channel, we like economics and ripping on Canada, and that's largely what I'm here for. So that brings me to what I view as the actual real threat to our civilization that is currently happening, that will test whether or not we experience a Bronze Age style collapse or not. Now, many of you have heard that the powers or the superpowers of the world change every 100 to 300 years or so. In the year 1000, China and India controlled roughly 70% of the entire world's GDP. In the 1500s, the Spanish and the Portuguese, led by the innovation and shipping technology, dominated trade and began conquering less developed people overseas. The Dutch became a dominant force in the world in the 1600s by pretty much birthing modern-day economics, banking, along with dominating maritime trade as well. Then in the 1700s, when the British and the French weren't busy trying to kill each other, they both emerged as superpowers during the Industrial Revolution and the Age of Imperialism, lasting up until World War I in the early 1900s. And then, after Europe was completely destroyed by World War I and decolonization by the European empires began, the Great Bald Eagle was there to pick up the scraps and become arguably the most dominant empire in the history of the world. When you account for the fact that at its peak, the United States had about 40% of the world's GDP by itself, yet only had 6% of the world's population, and that it was number one in everything from science, military power, cultural influence, economic size, and had more allies than arguably any other empire at their peaks in history, America probably had the greatest peak of any empire in history. But that was in 1950. And since then, other nations have been grabbing at the United States' hegemony. Japan turned from evil empire into the land of anime and electronics within the span of like 30 years. Russia, Germany, China, and tons of Southeast Asian nations have all been chipping away at the United States' world dominance for the last 75 years or so, with China gaining substantial economic ground by mass-producing everything, from underwear to totally unsuspicious $40 smartphones that don't spy on you for the good of Mother China. They don't do that. Truly. Probably. Who knows? And the question that comes up is what happens if the United States takes a backseat to another rising nation like China? Now, China has had a ton of economic trouble lately, so it may not happen anytime soon. But if it were to happen and the United States loses influence around the world and the Earth shifts to a China-centered influence sphere, what would happen? I mean, just looking at a map of China's trade influence around the world shows just how important China is as a rising superpower. So if this were to happen, would this be viewed as an end of the world scenario for a lot of people in the Western world or in the United States? To some, sure, yeah. But that's not the focus of this video, because what's coming will affect the entire world, not just the United States or China. So when a civilization starts, typically human populations grow, they become more productive, they invent new things, and thereby they have more resources, sometimes in the form of money. Governments then use that growth in money and resources to spend on things like infrastructure, military, welfare, healthcare. Or if you're in the United States, an experiment to see the effects of cocaine on the quail population. Yes, $500,000 went to that from the government. But so the spending grows and grows as the empire or the civilization grows. But then what happens when an economy temporarily stops growing? Well, the reasonable thing would be to cut back on spending because you have less resources now. But we are talking about governments and people in power here. None of them ever want to cut or reduce things. So what do governments do? They take out debt in hopes that future generations will be able to pay for things that the current generation doesn't want to lose. And virtually every country does this, except for Argentina right now. They cut 30% of their government spending overnight, then they experienced a horrible economic decline, followed by a recent significant rise in things like real wages and investor confidence. But anyways, for the other countries, what happens when this debt keeps piling up? Well, the future generations, if they are doing better, they can pay off that debt. But that doesn't really happen. So what happens if the future generations are doing worse? Well, welcome to what happens to nearly every single empire ever. The next generation will typically pay off debt with their own newly created debt and pass the baton along until nearly all tax dollars are going towards paying off debt. This is called a debt spiral and is extremely common when superpowers begin to fall. Rome, it piled on debt for centuries while funding its conquests. Eventually, they devalued their currency to pay off the debt, and it caused hyperinflation. Spain amassed tremendous wealth when it began its conquests and colonial projects, but also amassed so much debt that it may have caused the entire Spanish Empire to collapse. The French Empire had some of the largest colonial projects and harshest wars in history. The country thrived and then voila! Debt came for them too. The Ottomans collapsed under debt to the European powers. The Soviet Union, the Qing dynasty, all of these superpowers tried to maintain its public spending with debt, which likely hastened it to collapse. And now looking at all of the superpowers around the world today, all of them are laden with debt. Even China. I mean, heck, 10 years ago, China was allergic to taking on debt. Now it seems like it's drunk on debt. But there are a few countries who, despite everything, have managed their debt situations relatively well. Norway nationalized their oil resources and put it into a wealth fund worth almost $1.5 trillion right now. And this fund helps pay for a lot of the public expenditures for the country, including surgeries to make everyone tall and beautiful. Sweden and Denmark have a history of budget surpluses and tight public spending. And I know that some people say that the reason why they don't have a ton of debt is because they have such high taxes. But I mean, Canada and a few other countries have a higher total tax rate than those countries, and yet countries like Canada have insane amounts of public debt. So eventually, almost every country will run into a debt problem, unless they take a Scandinavian type of strategy to their public spending. But the larger issue coming, which may lead to the end of the world, is actually something that I mention frequently on this channel. And that is actually the Empire of Manitoba rising up to conquer the world in the name of snowshoes. But really here, the key issue is the economic erosion of humanity. And by that I mean month by month, year by year, the middle class is shrinking and more people are being pushed into the lower class. Or into debt where they feel like they cannot live their life without owing something to someone. Could be owing something to a bank, the tax collectors, credit card companies, your 300-pound grandpa who bought 2 houses in the 1970s and was worth $5 million now, and says it's because he was smart. And so that mentality of a shrinking middle class, having less freedom in your life, less amenities, or less public expenditures. And also things like rising crime, homelessness, drug addiction, and so on. And also things like you get to see the latest horrors of the world on your phone 24/7. When 150 years ago, in the preceding 5,000 years, the average person lived on a farm and didn't care about some celebrity thing that happened 10,000 kilometers away that's going to make you angry. But now all of these things are colliding and bringing uncertainty to our civilization all at once. Uncertainty about whether the economy will get better or whether the average person's life will get better. Sure, there are millions of people around the world every year who are lifted out of poverty and earn a little bit of money now. But what is a little money without freedom? You see, I have had this hypothesis for a long time that we will view this era that we are living in right now as the era that gave birth to a new life form in robotics and AI, also an era that will lead civilization back to a society resembling feudalism, where the rich and powerful own virtually everything, and an era where we got to live through the beginning of the end. But I don't think this will be the true end that a lot of people think it is, just by our definition. You see, something that people don't think about is that after Rome fell and the Dark Ages consumed the entire world, leaving everyone poor, illiterate, and in bad health, like Alabama, well, those Dark Ages, well, they weren't really that dark. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe didn't collapse into chaos. It adapted. Monasteries became cultural strongholds, preserving knowledge like ancient Greek philosophy and medical texts, while Charlemagne spearheaded a mini-renaissance with educational reforms. Medieval Europe saw innovations like the 3-field crop rotation system and widespread use of water mills, which revolutionized agriculture and industry. Literature like Beowulf and intricate illuminated manuscripts proved creativity was alive and well, while Romanesque architecture laid the foundation for later Gothic marvels. Meanwhile, the Islamic Golden Age was thriving right next door, preserving and building upon Greek knowledge while making groundbreaking contributions to science, medicine, and mathematics. I mean, pretty much anything that starts with the letters ALG, like algebra, was from the Islamic Golden Age. Trade with the Islamic world brought advanced ideas to Europe, further dispelling the notion of a dark era. Sure, there were some rough patches during this time. There were plagues, Viking raids, and beheadings. But you could argue that the average person's life may have been better just a few decades after Rome fell than it was before Rome fell. So to sum it all up, it's up to us as people to help decide whether to fold to the elite and let the government run up deficits forever, or you can fight back. Hey, fight and you may die. Run and you'll live, at least for a while. And dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all of those days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom? Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.